All right. So as I was thinking about what to talk about today, it kind of dawned on me to kind of discuss why I think the wide receiver market is really inflated this year. And the idea behind this is, as much as we're looking for this year's Josh Jacobs, we also have to be aware of this year's Allen Robinson. Someone that has been artificially driven up in value because we're not seeing the actual variables that say don't draft this guy. And in the case of Allen Robinson and Josh Jacobs, is it's tougher to look back on what we should have known and say, yeah, we should have known that. I mean, we should have talked about the offensive line of the Rams. And we should have talked about the fact that, like, if Josh Jacobs just puts it together in one season, he can be that guy. And we weren't looking at those things. And now we have to look at why we weren't looking at those things. So in the case of wide receivers, like, you can see on Underdog that we go to like the guy with the 20th overall ADP, which is Patrick Mahomes, going off the board first. And at this point in the draft, which, at 20 picks in, we have 12 wide receivers going off the board and only 6 running backs. So a good rule of thumb is that the first round of the draft is going to start off with elite players and go to sub-elite players. Duh, right? Like, no one needs to tell you that. But because of the distribution of players, you would think that those are going to be like 5 running backs, 5 wide receivers. So by the end of the second round, we're going to be looking at like 10 wide receivers, 10 running backs, and we're going to get the sprinkling in of elite tight ends and elite quarterbacks as it goes on. So by round 5, we usually have all the elite and sub-elite quarterbacks and tight ends are off the board, and all of the running back 1s and 2s and wide receiver 1s and 2s are also off the board. The more high-end players. These are the top 5 rounds are usually the premium picks in the draft. So if we look at where things are going, and I have ESPN pulled up, in a 12-team league, by the 24th pick in the draft, we see that the elite quarterbacks are off the board. We've also had 11 wide receivers and only 9 running backs. This is a little strange, and we've also been able to pull off, having a tight end come off the board too. Because on the other side of the coin, when we look at Underdog and where they go, we have 12 wide receivers. So we should be looking at about the same range, the top 10 running backs, top 10 wide receivers. We should be seeing it closer to being like running back 10 and wide receiver 10 coming off the board at the same time. So the question is, why aren't they congruent this year? And part of that is because the inflation that we saw last year. I have the wide receiver, or the scoring last year pulled up. And there's a slight difference between average scoring per game, which is more important than overall points scored, because average points per game gives you a rough idea of the over-under of whether or not how many points that guy's going to give you relative to somebody else. And if that guy, the chance that guy's going to give you to win or lose that week based off of that score versus overall points, which are consistency of the guy staying healthy. It's nice to have those points in our lineup, but week to week, I would rather have the win than the total points. The only time total points matter is potentially in a tiebreak. So in this case, like, we can see total points scored, or average points scored per week with Cooper Kupp, and he was leading the way at 22.4. And then we have a couple. We have Eckler and McCaffrey sprinkled in with Justin Jefferson, who was at 21.7. So then if we go down, we just see like a whole smattering of wide receivers: Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, and then we have fantasy MVP last year, Josh Jacobs. And then we have another running back, Derrick Henry. We have Travis Kelce. Then we have Saquon Barkley. Then CeeDee Lamb. AJ Brown, Joe Mixon. Some of this is going to be thrown off because, obviously guys who played less games, can get jumped up a little bit higher. But we're kind of less interested in overall total points as much as we are fantasy, or the fantasy points per game. And then we actually want to see an uptick in fantasy points per game as the season goes on, because we want a guy that's going to produce in the fantasy playoffs. So some of the guys that start slow, we want to see them tick up. So in this case, there's a lot more wide receivers that are on the board per points per game than there are running backs. Running backs can tend to get hurt, but overall they just weren't scoring. The lack of the bell cow. So what we should be looking at from a fantasy perspective is we know that there's more wide receivers that are available, so the overall price of wide receivers should go down. And we should be taking our cracks at a bell cow running back because there are less bell cow running backs. So last year, if we look at good old guys like Barkley, Henry, and Jacobs, in order for me to have a positional advantage at that position, I have to have one of 6 guys. And there's more cracks that I have had later on in the draft to go get a Devontae Smith to potentially gives me the ability to score points with somebody else when I've already faded the position. So this year, because of our imperfect understanding of how strategy functions, when we look at like underdog with our wide receivers, now we can start to look at like why these guys are likely overvalued this year. What are the flaws behind the guys that are being driven up? And in the case of Justin Jefferson, who's the 101, and to be honest, if I had the 101, I'd probably be taking him too. But the reality of it is the Vikings started to see a problem last year with bracket coverage on Justin Jefferson on the backside. That's why they went out and they drafted Jordan Addison, because as the coach put it out, O'Connell put out that the number 2 wide receiver in Minnesota is going to see the most valuable snaps in the NFL, because if they bracket Justin Jefferson, that guy has to be able to beat one-on-one coverage on the backside. So why is Justin Jefferson overvalued from a fantasy standpoint? Because in order for the Vikings to be better at football, they have to throw the football less to Justin Jefferson unless they're double teaming Jordan Addison or TJ Hawkinson. That's just how the Minnesota Vikings have designed themselves this year. So from a fantasy perspective of Justin Jefferson putting up 1,800 yards receiving and 128 receptions and 8 touchdowns, as I pointed out before, you might see an uptick in his touchdowns, but his receptions and yards go down because they are throwing the football more to Jordan Addison and they're throwing the football more to TJ Hawkinson to punish the other teams that are going to take away Justin Jefferson. Because when Justin Jefferson had his quote unquote bad games last year, when he put up 2.5 points in the fantasy finals, and where was the other one? When he put up 6.3 against the Dallas Cowboys, if teams are going to take him away and the Vikings don't have an answer, they are going to lose the game. So another example of how this works in real football land as opposed to fantasy football land, you should all be aware that everybody's like, oh, Cooper Kupp was on pace to have a better legendary season in 2022 than he was in 2021. Well, and that's if he hadn't got hurt. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, because everybody in the NFL knew where the Rams were throwing the football, and they were more than happy to allow the Rams to throw the football to Cooper Kupp, so the Rams would be the worst team in football and lose all their games. So if you think that the Rams are going to allow are going to try and lose all their football games again by funneling targets to Cooper Kupp like they did last year, like I have a bridge to sell you. It's unlikely that the Rams are just going to go like, we're going to funnel all of our targets to Cooper Kupp, lose all our games. He's going to put up 2,000 yards receiving, but oh well, like you won your fantasy championship. That's again not how football is designed. They have to figure out a way to throw the other guys. That's part of the reason why they traded Allen Robinson away, because Allen Robinson was not going to be the solution that they needed in that offense. He just wasn't going to be able to work the backside like they thought he was, but that was partially because of the offensive line problems. So again, if you look at underdog and you see that Justin Jefferson is going with the 101, Cooper Kupp is now going at the 105, why those guys are likely slightly overrated in your draft versus those running backs that are more like unicorns. Well, Justin Jefferson and Cooper Kupp already probably are going to not be as statistically good this year as they were last year. So this part of the problem with like a Jamar Chase is you can, in my mind, I'm not interested in Jamar Chase at all. Just like I'm not interested in T. Higgins. T. Higgins going off the board. Where's he at? Wide receiver 13, 28 overall on ESPN. Like I said, I tend to think I like ESPN's rankings better because when we go over to Underdog and we go hunt down our T. Higgins, we see that he's going off the board slightly higher at 24 overall, wide receiver 14. T. Higgins is capped in the same way that Jamar Chase is capped. When teams decide they're going to take away Jamar Chase, the Bengals are going to throw T. Higgins. And when Jamar Chase can have his games, T. Higgins is going to not have his. That's, again, this is how football's designed. Like, it would be nice if everybody could come out and score 50 points a game, but you have a defense that's trying not to lose a football game. The same way with like Tyreek Hill going as wide receiver 3 overall, 1,700-yard season. That's great if they can do it again. Everybody's worried about Tua staying healthy. The reality of it is, if Jalen Waddle becomes the recipient of Tyreek Hill being taken away, Tyreek Hill's value goes down, and Jalen Waddle's value going at pick 17, wide receiver 11 overall, goes up slightly. So now a guy that should be valued as a flip of the coin, first to second round, late first, early second round draft pick, is going more mid second, when his value is maybe, or his range of outcomes is likely a little bit higher. He's probably going where he deserves to go, but you have to understand that like a guy like him can go a little bit higher, but his floor or his ceiling is always going to be cut by what's his face, Tyreek Hill. And it's the same thing when we keep going down Stephon Diggs. There is a reason why the Bills drafted Dalton Kincaid in the first round of the draft. It was because everyone knows where the football is going with the Buffalo Bills. They don't want Josh Allen to take as bit much of a pounding, and they want a better distribution of targets to other people on the field. You can always throw to Stephon Diggs when you need to throw to Stephon Diggs, but what do you do the rest of the time? It's part of the reason why Gabe Davis is slightly undervalued this year, because he didn't blow up the way people thought he was going to do last year. There's reasons behind that. But now if you look at Stephon Diggs, he's going as wide receiver 5, and knowing that there's probably going to be a wider distribution of targets going on in Buffalo, his ability to go up and finish the season higher than wide receiver 5 is capped. It likely is capped. It doesn't mean that there's no range of outcomes where that occurs. It just means that it's tougher to make the argument that he's going to finish as an 1,800-yard receiver against Justin Jefferson, when there's a just as good a chance that he finishes another 1,400-yard season, because they distribute the ball better this year. And it's the same thing as we go down to like AJ Brown going as a top 10 pick. AJ Brown's going to be capped by the offense being good, period. There are going to likely be DeAndre Swift games and Rashad Penny games, as much as there are going to be Jalen Hurts games and Devontae Smith games and Dallas Goedert games. AJ Brown is now capped. He's not going to be able to go out there and put these high volume games together week after week after week, because the Philadelphia offense is just not designed that way. So for him to finish much higher than wide receiver 6, there has to be some variable that we're not seeing. The problem that we didn't see with the Rams offensive line last year, that we didn't see with the why Josh Jacobs was going to be the fantasy MVP, there has to be something built into that. Otherwise, you're drafting the wide receiver 6 to finish no better than the wide receiver 6, when a differential in target distribution for the Eagles this year could mean that he's slightly worse. Devontae Smith and Dallas Goedert are slightly better. Same thing with CeeDee Lamb, and I love CeeDee Lamb this year, but not at an ADP of 11 or in ESPN leagues where he's going at 14 overall. The problem is with Dallas is Dalton Schultz left. Vacated targets tend to go to running backs. That means Tony Pollard, who I really, really like this year. They also brought in Brandon Cooks to take over as the de facto wide receiver 2. And that means Michael Gallup goes to wide receiver 3. CeeDee Lamb's going to be working the slot. That's amazing. But again, we have the target distribution problem that if teams start taking away CeeDee Lamb, those targets go someplace else. Those targets are likely going to go to Tony Pollard. But if they don't, they're going to go to Brandon Cooks, or they're going to go to Michael Gallup, because teams want to win football games. They're just not going to allow the Dallas Cowboys to go out and throw to CeeDee Lamb, as I bring up good old Justin Jefferson, because Justin Jefferson is the benchmark right now. They're not going to allow the Dallas Cowboys to throw the football 11 times a game to CeeDee Lamb if they're actually trying to win the game, because the only way that they're going to allow the Dallas Cowboys to throw the ball to CeeDee Lamb 11 times a game is if, in the case of the LA Rams last year, they are going to allow the Cowboys to lose the game by funneling targets to a guy that they know that they're going to throw the football to. That's why a guy like Nick Chubb, who I really like, as I brought this up before, he's going at 12 overall on Underdog. He's going 18, believe that or not, or 19 on ESPN. Here's a guy that a slight uptick in his receiving value, a slight uptick in the overall offense, and Nick Chubb has this pathway to the fantasy MVP this year, going at not going outside of the first round of the draft. And you're going to tell me that potential avenue for Nick Chubb to finish with a higher points per game than even Justin Jefferson is something that I should be not valuing later on in the draft than a guy that I know that is going to see bracket coverage because it was effective against Minnesota last year. And they brought in the solution to the problem that they had. See, that's the problem with why the draft has been, or the wide receivers have been overvalued this year. And again, to continue with Amon-Ra St. Brown has a limited route tree. He's a slot receiver. He doesn't see deep targets. We need deep targets. Deep targets are better for fantasy than short targets are. He's going to be a target hog, but how he's going to be able to push certain numbers up to be the wide receiver overall, one overall, I don't know how you get there. So you're drafting a guy to be wide receiver 8 that maybe has a capped upside as wide receiver 5, but I'm taking him ahead of a guy who's a league winner that has a range of outcome for a league winner. I want to win my fantasy championship. I don't want to fizzle out in the fantasy semifinals. That's just not how I try and win my games. Same with Garrett Wilson. I love Garrett Wilson. You are drafting him at likely the peak of what he can do this year, because the Jets have a good defense. They don't need Aaron Rodgers to be the league MVP. They need Aaron Rodgers to win them games. They have Breece Hall, who will eventually be healthy, and a running game. They don't need Garrett Wilson to be Justin Jefferson. They need Garrett Wilson to be what Garrett Wilson did last year. That's all they need. Devontae Adams, who I think is low on Underdog. I think ESPN, he's going higher. Where's he at? He's number 11 overall, wide receiver 5. I think that's much more in line with what he's going to do. The problem with Oakland is they're just probably not going to be good. So I think you are getting more or less what he did last year. He's going to be a year older, but the ability for the Raiders offense to be good, to give him better looks, to give him more touchdowns is going to be capped because they're likely not going to be good. Again, with Barkley, who probably has the highest upside of anybody in this year's in fantasy football this year, because to be hyperbolic, and yes, I'm exaggerating, he's the one guy that you could sit there and go, well, if there's a guy that can score 30 touchdowns, 2,000 yards rushing, and 1,000 yards receiving, it's Saquon. Nobody else can do that because no one's going to get the volume on the ground that he's going to get and then potentially be used in the passing game. And if he's used correctly, you can get a legendary type upside from Saquon Barkley. But now you're going to take him in the second round. It would be great if you can get Saquon in the second round of the draft over guys that are capped in their wide receiver ceilings, because again, risk versus reward. And as I said before, like if you give up your ability, if you give up your risk of losing your league for safety, you're not going to win your league. That's just the brass tacks of it. Like, so when we look at, ESPN, who I said is better, the rankings are better. Barkley is running back 4. He's going number 9 overall in the draft, and that's more likely for his range of outcomes. Yes, he probably may not finish as running back 4. The chances of having a legendary upside season are low, but also if he stays healthy, the chances of him finishing outside the top 10. And if you're just putting all these wide receivers in your back pocket and you're expecting this massive upside, when again, like Jalen Waddle, who would be going in the same pick, is likely going to have his ceiling capped by Tyreek Hill being on the field. And again, I love Tony Pollard. I don't need to talk about him. It's not about his touches in the running game. It's about Dallas having a good offense. That means he gets to the opportunity to score more touchdowns, and there are targets available to go to him in the passing game. Receiving work for running back is better than rushing work. So I want touchdowns and I want receptions, and Tony Pollard is looking at it. And in order for me to not take Tony Pollard, I have to take a cap Jalen Waddle or a cap Chris Olave, because that New Orleans offense may be better, but they have other weapons in the New Orleans offense, up to and including Alvin Kamara, who is used in the passing game, who will eventually come off suspension. And so again, with Chris Olave going at wide receiver 12, can I see him finishing as wide receiver 6? Yes. But is that enough to outdo his ADP, where I would take them to pass on a running back who may legitimately put up those fantasy type seasons where you have to get up to like 20 points per game, 22 points per game, 21 points per game? That's 20 points and above per game is what you're looking at to have a legitimate elite player. And we're passing on all these guys for capped guys, especially with teams that have made certain moves to cap their players. So even a Derrick Henry, who's safer, may not have the receiving upside, is going to have the ability to outdo Devontae Smith in the same range, because Devontae Smith is always going to be capped by that offense. It's just the way it goes. So again, when I'm drafting, I'm less concerned with, I need a wide receiver here, as much as like, does this guy give me the ability to win my week or win my league? And when we're pushing wide receivers up, at a disproportionate rate to the running backs, we have a problem. So that's, again, ESPN's a little bit better. The snob leagues like Underdog, they're pushing guys up well beyond their ceiling to be able to win you your league. So anyway, that's my thoughts today. Yeah, it's been a little long, but whatever.